What if the very strategy parents believe will give their child a competitive edge is actually increasing the risk of injury and shortening their athletic career? Welcome to the Aging Well podcast, where we explore the science, stories, and strategies that help us live longer, healthier, and more purposeful lives. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong, an exercise physiologist with a passion for making science simple and life better as we age. In this episode, we explore the science and consequences of early single-sport specialization in youth athletics. My guest is Dr. Alan Resnik, an orthopedic surgeon and author of the Knee and Shoulder Handbook. Dr. Resnik argues that specializing in one sport at a young age does not improve a child's chances of going pro, but it does increase their chances of overuse injuries, joint damage, and mental burnout. Today, we'll examine what the research says, what he sees clinically, and how parents and coaches can build resilient athletes for the long haul. Remember, aging well begins in childhood. Yeah. So Dr. Resnik, welcome to the Aging Well podcast. It's great to have you back. I think it was in your last visit that we focused more on the older adult. On this podcast, we believe that the aging well begins in childhood, likely before conception. So I'd like to today pick your brain on sports specialization among young athletes. So welcome back.
Well, it's a great topic. As you know, I've taken care of young and old athletes and athletes of every type. And the thing that the Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons focused on a few years ago, and other experts as well, and a lot of pediatric experts started to focus on, is that kids are actively growing. And because they're actively growing, they're sensitive to stress and repetitive use injury, particularly in the area of growth. So as you grow your new bones, part of it is cartilage and soft. And in fact, the way it works, the bone expands in a very, very soft marshmallow kind of tissue, and then it follows up with calcium and calcifies and becomes harder. And that happens all throughout childhood. But the problem is, as that process occurs, those specific areas are sensitive to stress injury and overuse injury. And I think that's where we get into trouble.
So kind of starting with the big picture, what is single sport specialization, and when did it become so popular in young athletes from your experience?
Yeah, this is it's sort of a pendulum too, because I think if you really look at it today, there are some people pushing back against this idea. But it probably goes back to the Russian athletes, when the Olympics, when they used to win all the time. The Russians in the communist society, they used to identify kids at 4 years old that they decided at 4 they would become the national hockey player by the time they're 20. And they would look for certain skills, and they would follow them and put them in special schools, and they would eat, sleep, and drink hockey or any other given sport, whatever the sport might be. And to the extent that they had success with very high-level training and very intense training, I think that kind of spread maybe to some Olympic-level sports in the United States too, that people get pre-selected very early on for an aptitude of sports and train. And certainly with gymnasts, you see that because they have to be quite young and have to be lightweight and small. And we can remind me to talk about that for a minute, because that's a neat subject, gymnasts, because I like to talk about what happens as a gymnast grows, because it's an interesting thing all by itself. So if you remind me, we'll get back to that. But anyway, so having said that, parents had started to pick up on the idea that maybe their kid would be the best pitcher in the next Sandy Koufax or, Judd, and wherever, name a famous person. My kid is going to be that guy. And then they would start to put them in extra leagues and extra sports. And then there's an entire coaching industry that's built up around this, where people pay a lot of money to get their kid coached all year long in a given sport. So there's an economic incentive of a whole bunch of people to put someone in a sport year round, because they actually make money off of that. And that gets confused with quality and growth and health, right? Because at some point, it turns out there's a phenomenon called a single sport injury, where a certain level of sport for a certain amount of time is known to double the injury rates. And then those injuries become game limiting. And then you have the very same kid who had a lot of promise, and you give them one of these single sport injuries, and their promise goes away. And that's the real problem. And there's a lot of details we can get into about that as we talk today.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I wonder, is it, which came first, the chicken or the egg, regards to, as money has come into sports in the United States, is it the parents that are driving? They believe that their early specialization is going to give better odds for their kids to get a college scholarship or professional careers? Or is it this growth economy in all of the club sports that we see, particularly like baseball, softball, volleyball, basketball, where they're expecting these kids to be competing year-round and training year-round for that one sport? Have you noticed, which is it, the chicken or the egg, or is it a little bit of both?
No, I joke with my patients now. This is my new favorite joke with my patients, because this is always a discussion. I have back pain, I have sciatica, it hurts down my leg, whatever it is. It's a whole bunch of stuff, right? And they say to me, Doc, what came first? Was it the disc? Was it my muscle strain? Was it the nerve? Whatever it is. And I say to them, I said, it's interesting. People often ask me the chicken and egg question. And then I go to a farm, and in a farm, there are chickens and eggs everywhere. You can't escape the chickens and the eggs. They're all over the place.
Right.
And at some point, you see so many chickens and eggs, you go, does it really matter?
That's a good point.
Right. It doesn't really matter what came first, because they're just everywhere. And I think all those things you mentioned are all true. Every part of that is true. There's now, college has become a sport where now you can make a lot of money in college, and now all of a sudden it's kind of corrupting, because they haven't developed yet the rules that professional sports have, right? So they have no rules. So actually, the college level money is actually probably worse than the professional level money, because there's no unions involved, right? Which, good, better, and different. The unions do set some control for the players and some standards. And in college, every school is out for themselves because there's a big money on television, right? So there's a lot of back deals that we don't even know about yet, that I'm sure once we find out about them in the next year or two, we're going to say it should be not allowed, time out.
Right.
We shouldn't really allow that to happen, because that's really bad for the kids. And the point of the college scholarship originally was, kid has some aptitude, we'll give him a shot at playing some sports. Yeah, we know that less than 1% get anywhere, less than 1/10 of 1% get professional, but it's a chance for someone to get a free ride for college. And if they take full advantage of it, it's an absolute wonderful opportunity for them to get an education for free, right? And the money in the background paid for that, right? Now the money's in the foreground. I don't think anyone really cares if the kids get educated. Now we see some kids who've not gone to college and now 25 years old and enrolling for the first time in college, because they didn't make the professional team, but they're going to be good enough to be a high level, a highly paid college player. I mean, to me, this just doesn't make any sense, right? So that's a whole nother, we could do a separate podcast about that. Let's get back to the kid thing. And let's put that aside for a minute, because I think that's a lot of weeds we don't want to get into right now.
Let's pause briefly to acknowledge an affiliate partner that helps support the Aging Well podcast. We're not sponsored, and we don't accept paid placements. But when you use our affiliate links, it helps us continue creating this show. One product I've personally vetted and believe in is Nemo, a simple but thoughtful solution designed to support knee comfort and mobility during daily activities. I appreciate its practical design, ease of use, and focus on helping people stay active as they age. It's a product I'm comfortable recommending because it aligns with our philosophy of supporting movement, function, and independence. If you'd like to support the podcast and learn more about Nemo, you'll find the link in the show notes.
But the kid thing is that there's a misconception that if you take a kid and you have them do the same exact sport over and over and over and over again, that they'll get better at it. And we've seen time and time again these spectacular stars come out of nowhere. And Mahomes is the one that always the sidearm quarterback, right? He throws the sidearm. Why? He played softball and he played baseball and he was a shortstop. And the look away, turn, sidearm throw was part of being a shortstop, right? And all of a sudden he blew the league away with this ability. Why? Because he played more than one sport. And I think people are starting to recognize that if you really want to get a quality player who brings something new to a game, you really want players that have played more than one sport, maybe even 3 sports, at some point, and because they bring skills in. And I often say that with orthopedic innovation too. Like, I have a bunch of inventions. I have 9 patents. There's all kinds of stuff going on. And I always think that the stuff that happens to me that makes the most sense, the next innovation always comes like if I'm doing a shoulder procedure and there's all these techniques, and now I'm doing a knee procedure, and then I realize that, wow, one of these shoulder techniques would really be cool in the knee, and I start to try it out and I go, wow, this is much easier, but someone who does shoulder only, never does knees, would never have the chance to cross over, right, and do that. And I think that's true in sports too, just to tie it together, right? So there are colleges that are actually starting to look at that when they recruit kids. They don't want to see a kid who just did football and no other sport. They want to see a kid who's a little more rounded in the sport background, because they believe that it adds agility, it adds other skills, it strengthens other muscle groups. And net, the kid is going to be a more resilient and probably better player, maybe less injuries, right? Because they haven't really injured themselves in the very thing we're talking about. So let's go to a real example, right? So what's a real example? Baseball pitching is the number one thing people talk about because that's the most obvious, right? So you have kids, there's pitch counts, there's a reason, because the growth plates in the elbow are so important. And if the elbow growth plates don't allow to grow properly, or they start to break down and you get loose chips around the capitellum, and that surface becomes eroded or fails, or the piece gets so stuck in the middle of the joint you have to remove it, you can never load that elbow the same way ever again, right? Because the articular surface is now damaged, the surface that's smooth inside. And those kids will eventually burn out, right? You've destroyed the joint at a very young age while they're actively growing, and that joint will never be the same. And the odds of them lasting into a college or even a professional career is almost zero, right? Once they've done that. So that's the thing. And then on the flip is like Tommy John surgery, like, I'll just get the Tommy John surgery. Well, wouldn't it be great if you never needed it?
Yeah.
If you actually took care of yourself all along and never needed that surgery to come back, and was aware that you were stretching your ulnar collateral ligament out of your elbow and, causing damage to it, and actually did this pitch count appropriately, rested appropriately, strengthened other areas appropriately, worked on legs and leg balance instead of working on strengthening your arm, because almost all pitching comes from your legs and torso, not really from your arm, and that's a misconception. I see kids in the office and they have elbow pain and shoulder pain and baseball pitchers, and I have them stand on one leg and do a one-legged squat, and you'd be amazed how many kids can't do it. They get halfway down, they're wobbling. If I touch them with one finger on the shoulder, they fall over. There's no way you can get any power now. At 13 and 14, you could be the best pitcher on the team and have no leg control. But as soon as you're 15 and 16, you're done. You're going to throw your arm out, because if your power is only coming from your arm, you'll never make it at the next level up, right? So these are all these things are interrelated. There's just so much going on there. You're smiling. You see it, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I see it a ton. I was thinking as you were talking about the injuries in Little League, I was thinking, if they make it through high school, they're going to meet Tommy John. And of course, you brought up Tommy John surgery. Yeah. And, I just, as somebody who has worked in sports performance training and those types of things, and I had a mentor a long time ago that he was a Division III coach of many different sports. It was a small school, so he taught coached basketball and track and field and cross country. But he taught me that, and he did it in all his PE classes as well, where, the most important thing to start with is getting the rotator cuff healthy and strong and keeping the hips healthy and strong. And I tell my students all the time, if you look at an athlete at any age and they're buckling their knees as they're jumping or moving, they're prone for an injury. And we tend to think of ACL injury, but you make a really great point of it's going to translate up into the shoulder if you're a thrower.
Right. And people underestimate the leg strength. Like, the joke was Tom Seaver was never as tall as the current baseball pitchers, right? And he was very famous. I mean, I'm dating myself because of the Mets. I was a Met fan in Brooklyn, back in the day. And although it's been glorified in Men in Black 3, so some kids younger have seen the famous 1969 World Series in Men in Black 3, because they said it was the most magical time in all history, that the most unlikely team in the most unlikely league in the most unlikely circumstances actually became world champions. But Tom Seaver was not that tall back then, and he was an amazing baseball pitcher. But if you ever saw his legs, they were like tree trunks.
Mm-hmm.
He had the strongest legs of a pitcher around. I mean, he really, if you ever met him in person, his thighs were big, and it was all leg. He had the motion, he had the ability to bring that ground force from the foot up through his legs, through his torso, into his arm. And his arm was just a slingshot.
All right.
But it was all coming from the ground force in the legs. And that's why he was just so amazing. And he was able to pitch 9 full innings, unlike, people can't do now. And do that consecutively year after year after year, because he just had so much leg control, and that's sort of missing lots of times, and that's what I see in my office a lot. So that's one area, and then there's some of the interesting ratios we should get into too a little bit, like how much should you rest if you pitch, right? So like they talk about if you're pitching 20 to 30 pitches, every 20 to 30 pitches should be 1 day of rest for little kids. So like, the kid does 75 pitches. It should be probably almost 3 days of rest in between. You can't pitch a kid every day. And then when you start to get to 80, 90, 100 pitches, when you get a little older, 4 days of rest. That's what they really need. So that's a thing. And then if you read the literature and you quote all the different, sources that give you the pitch count, they always give a range. If you ever look at the tables, you rest 1 to 3 days, you pitch 31 to 35 pitches. They give these big, comfortable ranges. And some of that is because I think everyone would balk if it was the middle of the inning and the kid came to 25 and you have to pull them.
Right.
So the rules say on the bottom, a little asterisk, if in the middle of pitching to a single batter, may continue. But these are all things that make the parents and coaches happy, have nothing to do with the physiological problems with the kid. And so I kind of it bristles me a little tiny bit, because if we really were serious, there would be a real number, and that would be the number. It wouldn't be these big comfortable ranges that people can play around with. I observed a dad coach, and this is many years ago, so it's not a HIPAA violation. It's not something I'm treating now that anyone could figure out I'm talking about them. This was like 20 something years ago. So long time. And I watched him at the game, and his son was pitching, and he was physically not pressing the thing. He would look at the pitch count, show the pitch count, but he wasn't depressing. He was pretending to push it, but he wasn't pushing it all the way, the pitch count. Because I counted and the numbers were different. But I watched him. I was like, he seemed like he's done way too many. I'm just a doctor at the game, and I'm just kind of watching. It wasn't even supposed to be, I'm not covering the game, but I'm just casually there because a friend's kid was playing shortstop or whatever. And I was looking at this thing, and I said, this must go on all the time. The dad coach and the kids pitching, and it's their son, it's an important game for whatever reason, and they're cheating on the pitch count. So that's, you're only cheating your own kid, right? And the other thing about that is that the multiple leagues, right? So you have a pitch count and they mark it down, you're in one league and the kid is in a travel league also, and they have their pitch count. And the kid pitches in both leagues. And then, right? And so the pitch count's fine in both leagues. The rest days are fine in both leagues, but both leagues aren't talking to each other. So they don't know he's pitching every other day, and it's every 4 days, right?
What about an annual count? I mean,
what?
Yeah, you don't hear anything about like an annual count of pitches, because,
Right.
we might follow those rules, but these guys, they play in multiple leagues across the year,
Right.
and they're not getting any rest between seasons. That's got to hurt
Right.
too. If you're enjoying the Aging Well podcast, be sure to like, subscribe, or follow on your favorite platform so you will never miss an episode. And if you find our conversations helpful, please share the podcast with a friend, because aging is something we're all doing, and we're better at doing it together. And support our guests in this podcast financially by visiting the affiliate links in the episode description below, and use the links or codes provided for discounts on products we have vetted and feel comfortable recommending to our valued viewers and listeners. Thank you, and now back to the podcast.
Right. So the injury rates, there's a couple other interesting stats if you look into it. One is, if you play a given sport more than 8 months out of the year, you're twice as likely to have a repetitive injury than the kids who do 8 months or less and do other things in the other 4 months or more, right? You're doubling your risk. If you participate in a sport, I love these little things to throw out there, quotes, right? If you participate in a sport more hours per week than your age, when you're under the age of 18, you're more likely to have a repetitive use injury, twice as likely. So like if you're 6 and you're doing a continuous sport more than 6 hours a week of a given sport, of a single sport every week, you're more likely to have a repetitive use injury than someone who does under 6. Right? And it's almost double the risk. So those are really interesting things you can hang your hat on, right? And then there's a 2-to-1 ratio. Like if the kid is doing outside fun, flying a kite, running with his friends, maybe playing catch, and does this competitive sport, and the sport is 2 hours to 1, more than 2 hours of sport versus 1 hour of fun play in a week. And now take into account that you shouldn't be doing more than your age in hours a week of an intense sport. Those kids are twice as likely to have a repetitive use injury too. So their free time, they do a half hour a week of free time, and they do 15 hours a week, and they're 13 years old, and they play a competitive sport. They're twice as likely to have a problem than the kids who are, doing under their age in time and hours. And part of those hours with a 2-to-1 ratio are actually fun. They're not serious,
Yeah.
So those are like funny little kind of rules of thumb that are thrown out there. Now, the stats are a little, it depends on which paper you read. There's a little give and take on some of these stats. It's a round double for some of them. Some of it's a little more, some of it's a little less, depending on which. But that's kind of a nice little benchmark to throw out there, and talk about what should your kid be doing, and those are things. The other one is in how much you should increase, like you're running, and how much you should increase each week. So a kid goes out and he runs a mile. What should he do next week? And the rule of thumb there is like 10 to 20% max. So like if he does 1 mile, he should put 1.1 to 1.2 next as little kids. The older kids are doing, if they do 5 miles, they could do 6, right? But they shouldn't be doing 5 and then 10, right? And while you're still growing, because you're more likely to have a stress injury there. So those are interesting little tidbits.
And you were talking about gymnastics. I want to make sure we get back to that.
Yeah.
What were you going to tell us about gymnastics?
Oh, there's so many things. The physics of it are hard. So this is the thing that's kind of sad is you have a gymnast, right, who's excellent at age 6, 7, 8, right? And then 9, they start to grow. And 10, they start to grow. And 11, they're really growing, right, actively growing. And there's a physical limit to how big you could be and be a great gymnast. And the reason is pure physics. It's the length of the mat and the number of turns you can make are governed by how much you weigh and how tall you are, right? Because if I could do 3 flips and I'm 6 feet tall, right, and I do 3 flips and I'm 4'11", I end up in a different spot.
Right.
It's very hard to do the 3 flips at 6 feet tall and end in the corner of the mat and still be in bounds at high speed. So you do 3 flips in the middle, all the moves you do, and you have to do that run and a vault and a double handstand and then land. The chances that you can hold that land, the bigger and heavier you are, drops dramatically as you get taller. So you see all these gymnasts are pre-selected. They're 4'10", 4'8", 4'11". They get getting shorter almost, right? So that's one piece of it. So you have this thing. The kid was a great gymnast till they were 8 or 9 or 10 or even 11. And then all of a sudden they grow 4 or 5 inches and then they can't do it anymore. And that's terrible because the parents of gymnasts are going to be the greatest because they win every medal at age 6 and age 7, and age 8, age 9. But then they hit the wall because they're physically not in that size group. And they say, why are all the gymnasts short? It's just physics. So that's a hard thing to explain to people. She used to be so good, why not? The other one is in gymnastics, and this again is there's a lot of pounding. The landings are pretty hard. There's a lot of pulling, your hanging ropes, all this stuff. You have to have a little bit of laxity because you almost dislocate your shoulders when you're doing the rings. So if you don't have that laxity and flexibility, you can't do it. And the last thing is that some of them, because of the repetitive pounding, actually damage the growth plates and stunt their own growth a little bit. So they do end up a little shorter because they're constantly compressing the growth plate as it's trying to grow from all the physical activity. So all those things kind of play into it. So that's interesting and different, but it's a physical limit. The kid comes in, come see me. Why can't they do it anymore? And they can't because they just can't make the flips. and land
I
in bounds.
actually, through some gymnasts I've known, heard a story. I'm not going to give too many specifics on it to potentially could give anything away, but there was a collegiate gymnast who her mother had been giving her puberty blocking drugs throughout her high school years. And the poor girl, I mean, she was, smaller, successful college gymnast, but she couldn't enjoy college because she looked like a 12-year-old. And, what 18, 19-year-old male is going to be asking a girl out that looks like she's 12 because you go out in public, even though she's of age, you look like, you're,
And that's sad. And the unfortunate thing, there's more stories of that we don't hear about, and again, getting back to the thing about, the pitch counts, the multiple sports, the parents pushing the edge, and sometimes financial consideration. Like I can't afford college, but if you get the scholarship, you can go. And then the kid gets an injury and then ends up not going. And that's so difficult. And, what do you say to the, you just can't, you can't do anything about it. It's a terrible injury. The Olympics was a great example of that. This particular Olympics, right? We saw a tragedy happen, and we know that she said, I was 5 inches inside my line, and you don't know was she 5 inches inside the line because she knew she had an ACL tear, and she felt getting the 5 inches in will give her a little extra speed, which will make up for the fact that some of the turns she won't make the way she wants. Was it a deliberate choice to be 5 inches inside her old line because she didn't think she was going to be able to do it because of the ACL, or was it just a calculated error?
Yeah.
So, we don't know. We don't know what was really going on in her head, but she admitted it afterwards. She says, it was my fault. I was 5 inches inside my normal line when I hit the poles. So that's a thing. The other one, I don't know, get to this one. This is I love this one because it explains so much in kids when they're athletic. And it happened to me, and I know it's happened to a lot of kids, is that there's an internal sense of proprioception. Are you familiar with the idea of proprioception, right?
I better be
you
in my
close your
field.
eyes and you can touch your nose, right? You can do it. Why? Because your brain knows where your hand is. And for other people to understand, I said, look, it's like GPS, right? You get in your car knows where it is. So your hands know where they are, your feet know where you are, your head knows where it is, you can touch your nose with your eyes closed, right? What happens when you grow 5 inches in 1 year, right? The GPS for your hands, eyes, nose, all that stuff is all related to muscle length and muscle movement and the length of the bones. And it's learned as you develop your skills, right? So when you grow rapidly, the calculations that are already preset in your brain are wrong. Your hands aren't where you think they are. Your feet aren't where they think they are. And so if you ask a kid who just grew a lot to try to close his eyes and touch the nose, they have a hard time doing it because they don't really know where their hand is. And you see this a lot when kids have the growth spurt. All of a sudden, they become very gawky on the basketball court. They're behaving like they have two left feet. Their feet are bigger, but they're behaving like they have two left feet until they kind of get back into themselves and learn where their hands and feet are. And so it's like a normal process that an athlete might, after a growth spurt, drop in skills very quickly and then get them back with practice. But what happened? You used to be great. And that sometimes can be devastating because then they stop playing sometimes. They're so gorky they don't want to play. So that's another little thing I've observed over the years.
I'm going to take an approach here that I would not take because I know the answer to it. But so you have a parent that says, well, then doesn't it make sense for my son to participate in this sport year round so that we're keeping up with the skill development as the body is changing instead of having to come back and relearn skills every season?
Yeah, it's so I love when you start to think about AI and training AI. I actually think, and I read a lot about AI, and I'm kind of very interested in it in general. I actually think AI gives us an insight into the human brain that we didn't really have before, and I'll explain that. So when you train a model, right, and you train it, and it trains in 2022, it doesn't know anything from 2023, 24, 25. It doesn't, right? So you have to retrain it. You train in 2023, it doesn't know the next one, right? So as you're growing, if you train all year, you're training for the next 1 inch. The next inch after that, it doesn't know. So it almost doesn't matter. You can do all that. Your still brain is going to have to readjust every time. And you can even make the argument that maybe doing all that is even more confusing because you're just using up a lot of neurons to train for another length of your arms that it's only going to be good for 6 months and then you have to do it again. Then maybe you should just go through the Gorky stage, not worry about it. And then when you finally get to your mature height, get back into it again. When you're going to train for what your ultimate high school, college, and adult life lengths are going to be, and that GPS will be locked in maybe better. I don't know. It's a theoretical consideration, but I think it's a good understanding if you think about it in that way, because the AI is modeled on how our brains work, right? Neural networks and nerves and how they talk to each other. Now, it's crude. It's not what we do. It's actually got a better memory than we have. It's not as plastic. But I think a lot of the things in our own brain do work that way. And because it does, that the analogy is good and useful.
I like that analogy. That really works. I got to keep that in the back of my head when I'm teaching. Let's pause for a moment to thank the affiliate partners who help support the Aging Well podcast. We're not sponsored and no company pays for airtime here. But when you use our affiliate links, it helps us keep producing thoughtful, evidence-informed content. One brand I genuinely trust is Oral Wellness, especially their Glutarol Plus, and copper peptide formulations. I've spent time vetting their science, their ingredient quality, and their transparency, and I personally use these products in my own wellness routine. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and exploring tools that may help you feel and function better, check out Oral Wellness in the show notes. To help students understand that a little bit more. And so what are some of the most common injuries you're seeing in young athletes who specialize early?
Well, there's the common ones of the elbow, right? The things you see there. The other one is Osgood-Schlatter's disease. I think a lot of people know what that is. A lot of people don't know what it is. But if you ever see an adult with a very knobby knee right below the kneecap, they had it when they were a kid and they ignored it. And that's a traction injury. That's a little different than some of the other ones. So that's a traction injury. So the elbow one is compression. Repetitive compression crushes the bone, destroys the growth plate, fragments the radial head. Osgood-Schlatter's is your kneecap is attached to your tibia by the patella tendon. Everyone kind of knows what that is. But the growth plate is right under that. So if you imagine a shelf, and the growth is in between that space, right? Because the top of the tibia grows and the tibial tubercle grows. So if I pull on the patella tendon all the time, eventually I'm going to crack that and pull it up. So then that becomes lengthened. And then sometimes this just breaks completely through right there. And that becomes a separate fragment. And so the patella tendon is like pulling on it and you want it to heal. So my other little joke I share with people is like, if you have a black eye and I punch you in the black eye every day, will it ever get better? Right?
No.
You're like, why are you punching me in my black eye? Dude, what's wrong with you? Can't you see I have a black eye, right? But, you have a kid who has developing Osgood-Schlatter's, it's painful to him run and jump, and someone says, oh, you just run through, it'll be fine. Well, that's the wrong answer, right? And the right answer is actually you rest until the pain goes away. Maybe you supplement vitamin C, vitamin D, and calcium, make sure they're getting enough of it so the bone will heal. But the right answer is to come off the activity until the pain goes away and then start back as it's more comfortable, because you want that growth plate to stop being cracked. You want the bone to heal, and then you go back to running and jumping. And you see that with basketball players more than a lot of other sports, jumping, running sports, maybe volleyball. You run into the net, stop, run tennis, run in and stop, basketball, run to the end of the court, stop. And those are the kids that get kneecap pain and Osgood-Schlatter's disease, which is not really a disease, it's really just a traction injury of the growth plate. It's a crack that you're propagating by stretching it. Whereas some cracks are, I'm trying to bend it and break it, right?
Right.
And others is I'm hitting it with a hammer every day, then you got a crack in the bone that way. So all those things happen. The other one is Sever's apophysitis, which is the Achilles tendon attaches to the back of the heel bone, the calcaneus. And that's a growth plate too, and you can injure that very similarly to the way you get jumper's knee or Osgood Schlatter's. Jumpers is interesting. It's a stretch injury on the other side, the kneecap side of the patella tendon. So if there's a sleeve of area, the cartilage grows around the kneecap. So if the kneecap is there and that sleeve of cartilage grows, if I have the traction injury on the other side, I'm pulling that sleeve down and it elongates the bottom of the patella. And sometimes I'll take an x-ray and it'll almost look like a little nose sticking out at the bottom of the kneecap that's a little longer. And those kids had jumper's knee, which is a different thing, but same kind of injury, but on the other bone. So those are things that are common. And then there's stress fractures, right? So you're running and you get a stress fracture. And then the last one, which is probably the most important one to not ignore, is the female triad, right? Which is, not eating enough food, amenorrheic because they have no body fat, they don't have their menses, poor nutrition, so the bone density is not as good or not as strong, and they're not making new protein. They're actively growing and running, and they get a stress fracture. And then you find out that, they're also thinner than they should be, and they're very low body fat. And you need estrogen, you need body fat to make estrogen. So when the kids are super thin, and this is why it happened, like a kid who's anorexic, or just super thin, not even anorexic, with low body fat in a female, you don't make enough estrogen to mature and grow, right? You talked about the girl before with the hormones to block puberty, but you can block your own puberty by being anorexic or being too thin. And it's also a common problem with getting pregnant. There are women who are very thin who have trouble getting pregnant, and the main reason is they don't have a high enough percentage of body fat to get pregnant. And you think about that, that's a protective mechanism, right? You think about if food is sparse and I'm very thin, is the environment proper for me to carry a child? And the answer is no. So probably thousands and thousands of years of evolution said women cannot get pregnant unless they have a certain amount of body fat, because that means that there's not enough food around to support the pregnancy. So I think all of that is natural and normal, and we don't really think about it because we have a supermarket.
Yeah.
But someone back in the day, our genes thought about this and created a mechanism to stop us from getting pregnant when there was a sparsity of food.
Well, the interesting thing with that, too, is you look at some of the research done on the epigenetics of those populations, those women who, were developing all their eggs during a period of time when they're underfed, they're undernourished, there are periods of famine. They have a much greater likelihood of their grandchildren, their granddaughters dying of diabetes, because now you've built in this protective, we got to be able to conserve calories as much as possible because we don't know if food's going to be coming.
Yeah. There's a lot of, it's very interesting. Yeah, we don't go chasing after the food anymore for 3 days before we eat it. So we don't burn any calories when we drive to the supermarket, buy 2 chickens and eat them.
Right.
It's very different. We don't live in the same environment we were designed for.
And you're assuming that these young athletes are eating, chicken. A lot of them are eating just crap food too.
Right. That's another interesting thing is if a kid is overweight, it does not preclude them from being malnourished. Mm-hmm. Because the quality of the food makes a difference. And you can have a kid who's obese and say like, oh, how is this child malnourished? And they in fact are. And there is another injury, and this is an interesting one too. Males between the ages of 8 and 12, the growth plate around the top of the hip is sensitive to injury, stress injury. Males more than females, but and people who are hypothyroid is another thing that goes with that. So like if a boy is hypothyroid, they'll be overweight. They'll also be malnourished, but they'll also get what's called a slip capital femoral epiphysis, where the top of the ball, the ball of the femoral head at the top of the hip, will actually start to slide off its growth plate and fall backwards. And that's pretty serious as well, because that leads to what we see in adult athletes, cam impingement. You've heard of that with femoral cam impingement. They have a hip problem. They get hip arthroscopy. They take that edge down and they create more space for the hip to rotate because the shape of the neck of the femur and the ball is off. Well, a lot of those kids had a very small slip capital femoral epiphysis as a child. It was never diagnosed, healed slightly down. So instead of it being like a light bulb shape, it's like that. And then that's what impinges the top edge here. And that's what they correct with the arthroscopy. So yeah, these things are all related. to some things that happen later in life. And they're more likely to get degenerative arthritis of their hip later in life as well. So longevity-wise, we talked about the longevity stuff. If you get a slipped capital-femoral epiphysis, it's not diagnosed and not treated, and it remains displaced or displaces further, you're much more likely to need a hip replacement in your 50s and 60s than you would otherwise be.
So a lot of what you've been talking about seem to be more overuse type injuries. How do these differ from acute traumatic injuries, and why is that distinction important for parents to understand?
Oh boy. That's a giant kettle of fish, right? So there is every injury that's been on TV. You just name them: broken tibia, right? Broken ankle, sprained ligaments, ACL tear, rotator cuff tear, dislocations of the shoulder. You can go on and on and on. Rupture of the patella tendon, rupture of the Achilles tendon. There's always an athlete every year that has one of these things that you could just get a litany of them. Football mostly, but other sports as well. And all those injuries we're breaking a mechanism that's designed to give us mobility, right? If I break my ankle, I'm disrupting the joint that gives us stability around the foot, right? If I tear my ACL, I'm disrupting a ligament that keeps my knee from pivoting out of place when I cut and turn. If I tear my rotator cuff, I can't lift my arm sideways without using only my delta, which eventually fails because that's not correct. You need all the muscles to do it correctly. If you rupture your patella tendon, you can't walk. There's no way you can get any quads power into your tibia to be able to walk and balance if you don't have a patella tendon, because your knee focus really is all the quads force goes to the tibial tubercle directly through the kneecap and the patella tendon. Same with the quads tendon if you rupture that. So, all these things are problematic. A lot of them are related to multiple injuries, and a lot of them are related to other things that I like to talk about in kids, which, again, another separate subject, but I'll briefly touch on it if you don't mind. There's competitive mismatch lots of times in kids. So you'll have a 15-year-old that's 150 pounds, and you have a 15-year-old that's 180 pounds, and you have a 15-year-old that's 120 pounds, and they're all supposed to play football together. Not a good thing for the 120-pound kid when the 180-pound kid falls on him,
right?
Or tackles him. So, or the kid is just short; he hasn't had his growth spurt yet, and he's trying to play basketball. Whatever it is, the mismatch. But wrestling is the most obvious because they give you a weight class, right? And they know wrestling. If you put weight class against each other, it's not a pretty thing for the kid who doesn't weigh 200 pounds, and the kid who does. So I think that's another thing that, how do you get a lot of these injuries? A lot of these injuries are, age mismatch, size mismatch, skill mismatch, mixed teams where there's no recognition of that and during growth. And that's a source of a lot of injuries. And the other one is equipment and field conditions. I just put one of my little podcasts just came out, Rites of Spring. I actually did a little podcast years ago. It was about 2 minutes long about talking about what you should do in springtime when you get to the field. And you should look at it. The parents should look at it. Are there holes? Are there rocks? Did the grass grow in yet? Is my kid running down the field is going to land in that hole and tear his ACL or fracture his kneecap because someone didn't really take all winter, and now we're going out the first part of spring, and that's a problem. And the other problem is, did my kid grow between last year and this year, and is his equipment no good? The cleats don't fit, and the shoulder pads are too small or whatever. And the last piece is a field match. So and there's another set of data about this. There's a lot more injuries on turf than non-turf. You know that, right?
Right.
There's a lot of data to support that. And some of that is, I believe, and I'm pretty sure this is true, turf does not tolerate cleats the same way as grass. So if you take a grass cleat, which is very sharp, deep, and grabs a lot, and put it on turf, those kids who are wearing the wrong cleat will have much more knee and ankle injuries because the turf does cut away and give like grass does, and the cleat is making it worse. So there actually are special cleats for turf that are different than the cleats for grass. And there are kids who the mom gives them cleats, and you got your cleats, great, go out there. And they don't know that there's different cleats for turf and grass. And kids are not going to necessarily have two sets of cleats, one for turf and grass in high school. and they might go to a visiting game and be on, other one be on grass, right? So those things are subtle, but also an interesting problem because a lot of injuries related to that as well.
And does that apply to, like, when you and I were probably doing sports in high school, the turf was really much more like just that nylon carpet that was on top of a really hard surface.
It was particularly bad when we were in high school. There's no question about that. Yeah. But some of it's not better because turf also has ages out, and it's expensive, right? So if you have a turf that's 5, 7, 10 years old and it's aged out, too many winters or whatever conditions, and now the rubber and the quality of the surface is now deteriorated, or the undersurface has deteriorated, or there was the incorrect undersurface, that, right? The undersurfaces are all different. Yeah, you just don't know. Does the town have a budget to replace the turf whatever recommended for that particular turf brand that you got? Most likely it doesn't. So they'll push the limits of those materials very, very often. And not that it's horrible, it's not the end of the world, but I think you just have to respect it, that you need different shoes for that surf.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit easier in terms of the different shoes back when we would be playing sports because, we did have regular cleats for the grass fields, and then the turf fields were those little nubby kind of shoes that we were provided both. But now it's like, is there a real big difference between wearing your standard cleat on, the more modern, rubber-filled kind of turf as opposed to grass? Or, do you need particularly different shoes for those two field surfaces?
Well, I think it's even harder than that because I think that the turfs are different, and the conditions of the fields are different. So like you see football games, if the snow is very bad, right? People are flying all over the place, but Buffalo seems to do better. Why? They have special snow cleats, because they're used to doing it, and they put their snow cleats on. When the race car drivers, they have rain tires and they have regular tires and they have hot tires and cold tires. They have a tire for every condition possible. And I don't think anyone can really afford in a high school level to have 6 pair of shoes because they're going to play on Thursday here and Wednesday there. I think it was better when we all had kids. No cleat, flats, or you could play anywhere. You could be on asphalt. It doesn't matter. Your foot's not going to get stuck as you slide. Because you never had a cleat, most of it, actually, many of my friends, when we played everything, we never had cleats. No one could buy them. We just had the plain sneaker, whatever it was, probably pretty beaten up and worn out, but plain sneakers. So, for everything you did, you had one pair of sneakers and you used it for all sports.
Oh, yeah.
So, and you were lucky to have a good pair of sneakers. Oh, we have a good pair of sneakers. Oh, that's awesome. So, now you have kids who are buying like the Michael Jordan thing and spending $300-400 and driving their parents nuts, and to get one pair of shoes that's really for show and not for really anything. So it's complicated, I think, more than people appreciate.
Let's pause for a moment for an affiliate break. As always, this show isn't sponsored. We don't sell airtime, and we only share products we've personally vetted and believe in. One that stands out to me is Daily Brain Care from Dr. Lewis Nutrition. Whether you choose the convenient capsule form or the mix-in powder, this formula combines a spectrum of phytonutrients and bioavailable polysaccharides designed to support cognitive clarity, memory, and overall cellular nourishment. Ingredients backed by clinical research and thoughtful formulation. If you'd like to support this podcast and explore Daily Brain Care for your wellness routine, check out the links in the show notes below. So in addition to proper equipment, maintaining that equipment, maintaining the fit of the equipment, what else can our young athletes do to minimize injuries? And we'll get into more, the role of different sports, but like strength training, where do you stand in terms of, what young athletes should be doing resistance training wise?
That's also another great question, because every sport has specific strength training that's good for it, right? We talked about core and legs for pitching and things like that, but that's true for every sport. Core and legs are good. I think what gets people in trouble, if you have a very high speed, high twitch sport, which requires some finesse, and you over strength train and you get these very heavy, thick muscles, you can't have the agility speed that you want. There's these rare amazing football players that look like they're built like a rock, and yet they could do the 440, in an incredible time. Those guys are genetically different than everyone else. There is something about them that, they defy all laws of gravity, because the average person who bulks up as much as they do can't go that fast. There's a rate limiting step. If you get too heavy, you can't go that fast. So if you need an agility sport, and you look at runners and swimmers, and you look at people, right, or wrestlers, or bike riders for that matter, every sport almost has a body type that gravitates to be the best of the best, and they look like it. You say, oh, you look like a bike rider, right? You know it. You see them. You don't necessarily quantify it. You don't say, oh yeah, your thigh's a little bigger than your calf or whatever it might be. But you can see it across the room that guy's most likely, when you're a trainer and you're skilled at this, you can see across the room that guy probably rides a bike all the time. And you probably say it, right?
Right.
Guy really is a runner, or that guy really, is a swimmer, because they may have a much bigger upper torso and a narrow waist, right? So, it's got to be focused. It can't be this generalized, I'm just going to get stronger everywhere and I'll be great. I don't think that works. And the other piece of it is, are you going to lose your flexibility, right? So you need flexibility to prevent injury. So you have to have both. You have to have good strength and flexibility.
Yeah, I think it's important to really focus on training a total athlete when they're first starting really out training, which again goes back to the whole notion of not being, a single sport athlete, but trying to do multiple different things so the body gets that whole development. Because ultimately, if somebody is a really good athlete and they love a certain sport, they're going to be able to play at that next level. And any good coach is going to recognize this kid's a great athlete. We got a great strength and conditioning program. We'll put the weight on him that he needs to have on him. Do that in college rather than, you get some of these kids that are like 300 pounds as freshmen. Your body can't support 300 pounds. I don't care how tall you are. Yeah.
You mean in high school? Yeah. Doesn't make any sense. Yeah. And you don't know if you've finished growing yet.
Right.
So it's complicated. And then they do things, the supplements that, it's not clear if they're good or bad or indifferent. If you have a high school freshman doing creatinine, I don't know if that makes a lot of sense for anybody if they're not growing yet. They're not fully grown yet. But
I actually take a more positive approach. I mean, obviously not overdoing the creatine, but, from a brain standpoint, the current literature just seems to be...
There is supportive stuff, but I think when you have someone who's not fully grown and you start adding these things, I think you kind of tempt to get things out of balance a little while your body's trying to figure it all out. So I don't know if it's wise to do it if you're 13. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
I think the big question is the why are you doing it?
Right.
It's, at that age, for brain development, it makes sense. For muscle development, it's like your body is the most primed when you're right around puberty for the most amount of growth naturally. So why do you need to... I've had wrestlers that I worked with and I think to a certain extent he was trying to get a little bit of a rise out of me, but he's always asked me questions about steroids and stuff. Like, dude, first of all, you have a physique, you don't need steroids, and your hormones are so charged up right now. You add steroids on top of that, you're just going to mess yourself up for life.
That's true. That is true. And you can just talk to Hogan, like he's now, he did it and he had paid a price, right? And it wasn't good for him at the end of the day.
When I look at a lot of the football players that would have been in my era, I grew up in Pittsburgh, and we had Bill Fralick, who came out pretty early about, he was one of the first to really come out and talk about doing steroids, and he did it in high school. And he's dead now. I mean, he's my age, 62. I think he died, he was like 58. So many of those big guys have not lived long because of what they did to their bodies early on.
Sure.
So from your perspective, what does healthy long-term athletic development look like for children and adolescents?
Well, you just got to listen to it's so hard to give you cannot give a general rule for this because every kid is just so different. Their desires are so different. I think at the end of the day, you got to listen to your body, and, the kid has to have the opportunity to say when things don't feel good and not feel shamed by it, things like that. You want to make sure they have good nutrition. You want to make sure they're not, they're not the obese or overweight kid that has no caloric value. You just, healthy diet, healthy level of activity, a good mixture, as we talked about, good mixture of activity, not the one sport injury stuff. And then just listen to your body, and listen to your kid and let the kid have a window. Some parents really realize that their hopes and dreams for their own kid are based on maybe skills they see and they appreciate in a different way than their child does. And yet the child doesn't have that same desire or feeling and just to please the parent, right? So you have to give the kid a window to be able to be themselves a little bit and be able to speak up like something. I do believe in discipline. I don't think they should wuss out on their chores and, you should just let them get away with that. I think it's not the right answer either. And if they commit to do something, they should make a real commitment because it should mean something to them if they really want to do it. But, sometimes you just see kids going through the motion, they're not happy and no one gives them the window to, they're not, and they'd rather do something else they'd be much happier at. That's child psychology.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a whole different thing. So,
That was a hard thing for me as a parent. I mean, wanted my son in particular to do as many sports as possible. So he started with soccer, and we knew right away, first of all, I knew he was going to be a big kid. Soccer was not ultimately going to be a sport, but it's a good kind of starting to get, some physical activity. And for him, you could tell, if he could tackle the other kid to get to the ball, he would have been happy and he would have played soccer, but he didn't love soccer. Then he started football and he never loved football. And I didn't push him too much with that. We probably pushed him a little bit, but not too much. And he gave up football by middle school. And the only thing left was lacrosse and wrestling. And he wasn't that into lacrosse, and wrestling just kind of stuck with him. But there were times where I knew I was pushing him a little bit into wrestling, and it's like, I got to be careful here because, I know I'm really pushing to wrestling. I wrestled in high school, even though I have a basketball player's body.
There you go.
But and he did club, so it was like, you signed up, you got to do it. And I wanted him to learn the discipline. And there was one time I know I picked him up from practice, and he's all upset, and I was like, "What's the matter?" And he said, "Well, the guys were saying I suck." And I said, "Well, you do, but you don't have to. The reason you suck is you're not trying hard enough out there. You're just kind of going through the motions. If you want to not suck, you got to do the work. If you don't love wrestling, you don't have to wrestle." And every season he'd kind of go back, and then there was finally, I think, going into about 8th grade, he was not wanting to do it. I'm like, okay, you don't have to do it. And the club coach called, and he was like, hey, I didn't see Liam at practice last night. Is he going to wrestle this year? And I said, well, I don't know. He's kind of on the fence. And so I asked him, I said, hey, coach just called and texted me and said, he hadn't seen you, and he's wondering if you're going to wrestle this year. And he said, really? And just the fact that the coach reached out and was interested in him, he's like, yeah, I want to do it. And he never looked back, and he ended up, he went to states 3 times, and, I had to push him a little bit going into senior year. We had to push the weight up on him so he could wrestle heavyweight. But, he had a chance to wrestle in college and decided not to. He went into MMA, which that surprised me. I did not push him with that.
That is something.
And, when he was ready to stop with that, he stopped that. So it's tough for a parent, but I think too many parents tend to want to live vicariously through the kid and see bigger things than are there. And, we have to learn how to strike that balance between, encouraging physical activity and stuff that's going to build the discipline and the lifelong aspects of sport. I don't know if you're familiar with Joe Ehrman. He wrote the book Inside Out Coaching.
Yeah,
he played for the Baltimore Colts, probably back in our era. And he ended up coaching high school football for a number of years. And he was all about transformative coaching as opposed to transactional coaching. He was the type of coach who's like, parent would say, what's the team look like this year? So ask me in 20 years, when I see how they interact with their wives and their families and things like that. And that's what he was about, was coaching. And that's where we need to get back to in sport. It's not, these kids aren't playing sports to get an NIL. They're playing sports because it's going to make them better human beings.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thing to end on. Actually, I love what you said there. I don't think we better. You really want to make good human beings, because the number of people, there's a gazillionaires in sports, it's really a precious few. I'm reminded of the peekaboo, broke 11 bones and had a million surgeries, and then she had all these gold medals. And they asked her in an interview, was it worth it? Oh, every surgery was worth it. Every broken bone or every ACL tear was worth it. And then I see kids that have as many injuries who never ever make it past college, and they have issues long term. And they say, "Is for those kids?" And the answer is no. It wasn't worth it for them. They didn't get the gold medals. They weren't on TV. And then you got to think for a second that for everyone that is on TV, there's 1,000 more that have just as many injuries that never make it. And so on balance, for whole, is it worth it to have that one versus the 1,000 that are messed up now that work just as hard? And there's got to be a better balance of that. I think, a healthier balance that, there's a certain amount of injury that just at some point it's just not worth it. That's the quote, was it worth it, right? People ask, it was worth it. You're lying there in the hospital. Oh, it's always worth it, But, justify the horror that you go through if you don't think it is. So that's a little bit of a catch-22. You're not going to say it wasn't.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's a tricky thing to negotiate with your children. If you're a coach with other people's children, it's trickier probably and more serious. Because you could say something and change a kid's life in a bad way or a good way and not even know you've done it. I think about that a lot when I restore function for people, and I give them back what they had or close as possible, and you can't always give them back what they had, but as close as possible. And then I wonder often, what are they going to do with it next? And more recently, I had a conversation with a parent. It's a complicated story, but it's funny. It's like, I'm an orthopedic, so my extended family call and ask me questions. And my son's wife's aunt or uncle or some relationship had a kid who was playing and has a stress fracture of his lumbar spine. And apparently there's a family history of a congenital abnormality, and this has happened to the family and so on. And he was never willing to stop the sport. And I don't want to say a lot of details. He was stop the sport to let it heal because they were so deep in the sport. And I had a 45-minute heart-to-heart talk with the parent about it. And I said, listen, this is something that's not okay. This is something that by doing what you're doing is only going to get worse. And do you want him to end up with spine surgery because of this? Because that's, at some point, that's where you're going to end up. And they sent me a lovely video from the grandmother, actually saw my son and said, I wanted to tell you, what happened with so-and-so. And the story was basically the kid, they had the heart-to-heart with them. And the kid said, okay, and accepted it, believe it or not, because he was in pain, played, and he became the mascot for the team and class president.
Nice.
Because he redoubled his efforts in another direction. And they thanked me. They said, the kid is so happy. His life has new doors that have opened. And to graduate high school president and the mascot of the team and all the stories that go with that and what that sets him up differently than being a guy on the team in basketball who didn't play so well, or football, whatever sport it was, because their back was always causing them to miss games. And the psychological advantage of being student A versus student B, right? Student B is going to end up in a negative the rest of their lives because they've been a failure, right? And student A is a success, an absolute success, because they chose to pick away from the thing that was going to make them a failure. And so I think that's sometimes our role. as coaches and teachers and physicians, is to give that extra time to try to say, look, let's look at the reality. Let's play this forward. Where are you going to be? Is this a good choice for you ultimately? And for a lot of times it isn't. And so that's where it falls out.
My last question for you is going to be, if you could give one piece of advice to parents who simply want their child to thrive physically and emotionally, what would it be? And I think you just answered that.
Yeah, that is the answer. That is the answer for it, because you gotta know when to throw in the towel sometimes and try to pick a little different direction. And sometimes it ends up being much more satisfying, right? So
Right.
you don't know until you open that door. And that other expression, right? Every time a door closes, another one opens, right? So I think that sometimes kids don't have that insight or feeling. The door is closed, their life is over. It's not true, so I think you got to keep that in mind.
And I would say, look for coaches and doctors who are transformational as opposed to transactional. You can get a lot of, sports medicine doctors, and I'm sure you know of people like this that will do whatever the parents ask just to get the kid back on the field, whether it's an unsafe injection of something or, signing off when they shouldn't be going back, it's not time to return to play, and doing it because, they want the kid to be successful in the moment. They're not looking at that long term and, what's going to be the life of this kid 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 years from now.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So anything else you have for us in closing? One thing I want to make sure you underscore
I
where...
want to do the cheap plug that we always do, right? So I've written a couple of books. I have a big website, drresnik.com. That's drreznik.com. And I have a blog every twice a month sometimes that comes out with all kinds of tips and interesting things about injuries and prevention. So, and the books, the Knee and Shoulder Handbook, which is about how to live a active and pain-free life, about prevention and injuries and what you do about them. And then I have another book, which is hard to find on the web because of its title. And I laugh about it because it's I've fallen and I can get up. And I only did it because the commercials were so terrible. I've fallen, I can't get up. You got to stop people from falling down. What are you giving them the button for? Just stop them from falling in the first place. It's too late when their hip is broken. And so I wrote the book. So when you search it, you always get the commercial first. I've fallen and I can't get up. And the book is falling and I can get up. So if you go to my website, you can link to it and get it more easily. But those two books have a lot of tips for the older patients who might fall themselves and all the tips and all the reasons why you might fall, and for everyone else about shoulder and knee problems in the other book. So that's it. Blog, if you're interested, it's free, and it's free to everyone who wants to sign up on the website. You can get it.
We'll put links to all that in the description notes. And, I give a huge endorsement for the newsletters and the books because I get a lot of value out of them. I look forward to getting those emails from you every couple of weeks, the latest little subject in sports medicine. And so keep those coming, keep doing what you're doing, and keep aging well.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me today. It was wonderful.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure. And we'll have you back again. I'll try not to make it 2 years.
All right, there you go.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Aging Well podcast. Please like, subscribe, or follow, and share this episode with a friend. And be sure to visit the affiliate links in the description below. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep aging well.